Hi everybody, it's Julie. Welcome to Hello Monday. This week over on the Classroom blog, we are going to be talking about inks, like inks, all week long. And I'm actually going to be sharing some information about pigment inks today. And as you can see here in this photograph, I have a lot of different pigment inks made by a wide range of manufacturers. They come in beautiful colors, they come in metallics. Of course, you've got your basic black and white. And one of the things I did want to mention is that some pigment inks have different properties apart from other pigment inks. And so depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish, you may need a faster drying pigment ink or you may need a slower drying pigment ink. But in the end, ultimately, pigment inks are different from dye inks in that they are thicker. They're more like the consistency of like mayonnaise if I were to compare it to a food product. And I'm going to be talking about the different properties of pigment inks and in general the techniques that you can do with pigment inks. Now here I just wanted to show you quickly the difference. The dye ink on the left is made by Tsukineko. It's the Memento Rosebud, and then on the right this is the Memento Luxe, which is a pigment ink version also made by Tsukineko. So here you can see the same ink color and what it looks like in a dye ink pad and what it looks like in a pigment ink pad. And then I'm just going to stamp an image quickly here so you can see the difference between the dye ink and the pigment ink. And as you can see, the pigment ink is very thick. It is a slower drying ink as opposed to the dye ink, which absorbs into the paper very quickly. This is going to actually sit on the surface of the paper, and this is what enables you to heat emboss. So I'm just going to go ahead and impress this right next to each other, and then I can show you a close-up of what the two inks look like. Here they are, very close up. You can see pretty intense color. I'm going to sprinkle some embossing powder over the pigment ink. I did sprinkle some over the dye ink so you could see that because the dye ink dried so quickly, the embossing powder will not stick to it. And then the pigment ink, of course, is a slower drying ink, and it's a little bit sticky thanks to an ingredient in pigment inks called glycerin, which helps keep them tacky and sticky for a while. And there you can see how easy it was to heat emboss. Now you can use pigment ink pads for all kinds of different techniques. One of my favorites is taking the edge of the pad and rubbing that against some cardstock, and this is called direct to paper. And you can see how you get a different effect there than from stamping with the pigment ink. And you can also blend them very easily right on your stamp surface. So right here I'm using an ink dauber and I've just tapped it against a yellow, I think this is Dandelion by Tsukineko. And I'm going to grab the Rosebud again and ink up with another dauber, and then I'm going to start tapping that ink, and then where the two inks meet, I'm going to tap over the top and kind of blend the two together right on the stamp. And you can get some really beautiful blended effects by using this technique. And because the ink stays wet much longer than a dye ink does, you don't have to worry about the ink drying up on the stamp. So you don't have to hurry. You can just take your time and then go over there and go ahead and impress it. And if I wanted to, I could also heat emboss it. So I also wanted to show you how the inks will blend on the surface of the paper, and this is true of pretty much any pigment ink. You just take a dauber and load it up with ink and just start swirling it around there or brushing back and forth, however you like to apply the ink to the paper, but they blend very beautifully thanks to the creamy consistency right there on the paper surface. I also wanted to show you what they look like on different colors of cardstock besides white. Here you can see Dandelion stamped with dye ink on the left and pigment on the right, and the difference there on the craft and the black. And then also here I overlapped 3 different colors onto white, and you can see what the end result is when you stamp over the top of each other. Now my card today features a really fun ice cream cone image from a stamp set by Reverse Confetti, and I'm going to go ahead and ink up the cone part of the stamp with some dandelion ink, and then I'm going to take the Morocco, and I'm working with all pigment inks here. I'm going to ink up with a Morocco on that ink dauber and just apply some ink to the edge of the stamp and blend where the two colors meet. So this way I can get some shading right on the stamp image. And then I'm going to do something called kissing. I'm going to take a pattern stamp. This one is from the Wonky Backdrop set, and it has these triangles on it, and I impress that clean stamp to the inked cone, and it removed some of the ink. And this is a great technique to do with pigment inks that you can't really do that well or very easily at all with a dye ink because it dries too fast on the surface of the stamp. So now I'm going to go ahead and do some more blending. I did some angel pink there on the ice cream part of this image, and then I'm going to take the neon coral and go ahead and ink up around the edges and then blend where the two colors meet right directly on the stamp. And then I can go ahead and stamp that into place. Now, for some reason, I forgot to put a piece of foam underneath my project while I was working, so I'm rocking the stamp just a little bit to make sure that I'm getting a good contact between the inked surface of the stamp and the paper. But you can see how cool that blended effect is when you're done. Now, for this card, I decided to use a black card base, and I wanted to have a bit of texture and a background image to support the focal image. So I'm going to use this scalloped background image from the Wonky Backdrop set, and I'm going to ink up with Hero Arts pigment ink, and this is Unicorn. It's a beautiful shade of white that offers a really great opacity on black and dark colored cardstocks as well as craft. I absolutely love this. Probably of all the white inks I've ever used, this one is my favorite. I'm just going to close the lid there and apply even pressure across the whole surface so I get a nice impression across the cardstock, and you can see how well that white pigment ink shows up. And I did get like a little smear or smudge of white pigment ink there in the corner. I don't know how I did it, but I'm just using a white eraser to lift it off or erase it off while it's still wet. Now, I did go and heat set this ink because pigment ink will not allow tape runner or other adhesives to grip to the paper surface if they're wet. So you do want to make sure that you heat dry that pigment ink if you're going to use some adhesive over the top of it. And there you can see the finished card. We have more still shots available at the Classroom blog, and all the supplies and lots of pigment ink available at ellenhutson.com. Thanks for watching.